Hi, this is Rebecca Lane with Public Speaking at Full Sail Online, and I'm going to start this lesson out with a story. So, as I tell this story, I want you to just listen to it and think about the kinds of words that I'm using, and I'm not using them. It's a Roland Labarge who is retelling this story. Think about the words that are used. Think about the images that you get in your brain, and think about how they get there. All right? So this is a Native American legend called How the Beaver Got Its Tail. Once upon a time, there was a beaver that loved to brag about his tail. One day, while taking a walk, the beaver stopped to talk to a bird. The beaver said to the bird, "Don't you love my fluffy tail?" "Why, yes, I do, little beaver," replied the bird. "Don't you wish your feathers were as fluffy as my tail? Don't you wish your feathers were as strong as my tail? Don't you wish your feathers were just as beautiful as my tail?" the beaver asked. "Why do you think so much of your tail, little beaver?" asked the bird. This insulted the beaver, and he walked away. After walking for a while, he stopped for a drink by the river and saw a muskrat. He walked to the muskrat, and he said, "Hello, little muskrat. What do you think about my tail?" "Well, it is a very beautiful and big and fluffy tail," answered the muskrat. Is it also a strong tail?" "Why, yes, it is," said the beaver. "Do you wish you had a tail like mine?" "Oh, I didn't say I wanted a tail like yours. I just asked if it was strong," the muskrat replied with a disgusted voice. The beaver quickly turned and began walking back to his dam. He was angry because he felt that the animals were being very rude to him. He was very upset, and he decided to take out his frustration by cutting down trees. After cutting down a couple of trees, he came up to a very large one, and he knew that it would be a great challenge for him, so he went to it. But as he was cutting, he kept thinking about his tail, and he didn't notice that he was cutting at a bad angle. Before he knew what had happened, the tree began to fall toward him. He jumped to get out of the way, but he didn't jump fast enough, and the huge tree fell upon his beautiful tail. He tugged and pulled and finally dug away the earth to free himself. When he finally pulled his tail up from the tree, he was horrified to see that it was flat. The beaver was very sad, and he started to cry, and as he was crying, he heard a voice. It was the Creator. "Why are you crying?" asked the Creator. "A tree has crushed my beautiful tail," the beaver cried. "Now no one will like me." The Creator told him that a beaver is not liked for his tail, but for his kindness and for his wisdom. He also told him how to use his flat tail. "Now your tail will help you swim rapidly," the Creator said, "and when you want to signal a message to a friend, all you have to do is slap your tail on the water." Well, hearing this made the beaver very happy. When the animals saw his flattened tail, they were shocked, but the beaver said, "It's better this way." And from that day on, the beaver never bragged about his tail, and all the animals liked him. And that's how the beaver got his flat tail. Okay, so it's a public speaking class. Why did I just read you a Native American story? Well, the reason I read you this Native American story is because that story comes from a tradition of oral storytelling, and public speaking is rooted in this tradition of oral storytelling. Now, there's a difference between when we are communicating information orally versus when we are communicating information in a written way. What do you think the difference is? Really quick. What do you think? What's the difference? For example, what happens if I am communicating information via spoken word? What happens if you as the audience member check out? How do you get that information back? Okay, what happens if you check out while you're reading an essay? How do you get that information that you missed back? What's the difference? Now, I'm guessing that if you miss something when you're reading an essay, if you check out, then you probably just reread the parts that you checked out during, right? You take the time, you reread that paragraph. But if you miss that moment in a speech or in a spoken word or in a conversation, then that's just gone. You've lost it. So as a speaker, it's our job to craft our message to compensate for the things that happen to us as audience members, to us as listeners. Because we know that our audience is not going to hang on every single word that we say, and even if they're trying to, even if they're completely engaged, our audience will miss something. So this lecture is about those tools that you can use to help your audience retain the information that you are going to share. So When we're thinking about written language and oral language, one major difference is that spoken word is way more adaptive than written word. So if I'm writing an essay, I have to assume that I don't know who my audience will be. I'm not quite sure who will read it eventually. And so what that means is I'm going to be a lot more formal, and I'm going to be probably a lot more verbose, right? Because the words are all I have to communicate the information that I am saying. And I don't have a lot to compensate for it if my reader doesn't understand what I've said. I can't see them, and I'm not there to fix it, so what they see is what they have. Now, with the spoken word, we're able to adapt it, and we're able to adapt it in the moment. So if I am speaking to my audience and I see that they don't understand a word that I've used, then I get to choose a different word. Or if I see that they didn't quite understand the intonation, I can choose different intonation. And so with spoken word, it's very much more adaptive. And with that adaptability comes our freedom to be less formal. Written word, I have a chance to go back and reread it. And I can double check your grammar. I can double check your sentence structure. I can double check all of those things. But with the spoken word, the likelihood that your listener is going to notice and much less keep track of your sentence structure and whether you're using full phrases or sentences, as long as it's not distracting, probably they will not, because they will be thinking about images, and they will be thinking about the message and the words. So concepts are more important than using exact phrasing and exact grammar. So spoken word, it's much less formal. However, one of the things that we do want to use when we are thinking about spoken word is we want to make sure that we are including a lot more repetition than we're using in written documents. So I have a question for you. You listened to the story about the beaver. What was the beaver obsessed with? Do you remember? The beaver was obsessed with his tail. What was the point of the story? Do you remember? So it wasn't just that the beaver was obsessed with his tail. It was that this is how the beaver got his tail. And so the beaver started out one way and changed to a different way. And not only did the beaver's tail change, but also the beaver's behavior changed. And the reason you remember this is because there was a lot of repetition. The story was about the tail and the tail and the tail, and the beaver spoke to multiple characters about his tail. So the spoken word, this oral tradition, really revolves around using repetition. And the reason we use repetition is so that our audience does remember the main point of our story. So in that beaver story, we didn't just repeat words, right? It wasn't just a repetition of the word tail, but it was a repetition of a theme. It was a repetition of what the beaver valued. It was a repetition of behavior, so that when the behavior changed, we saw that. So another thing that we want to think about with spoken word is we want to think about our word choice. Specifically, we're thinking about concrete words versus abstract words. Now, concrete words refer to things that are tangible, things that we can touch. Abstract words refer to things that are more conceptual, like theories and the concept of love. That is an abstract word, but a heart is a concrete symbol of love. So when we're thinking about concrete versus abstract, we want to be, it comes down to being as specific as possible. So here's an example of an abstract sentence. Recently, Jane arrived in a vehicle. So how can we make this sentence way more concrete? Okay, so one step, we can address the word recently. So instead of recently, what can we say? Yesterday, Jane arrived in a vehicle. Or, at 4 p.m., Jane arrived in a vehicle. Okay? So, at 4 p.m., Jane arrived in a vehicle. We have addressed this. But there's still a lot more abstraction here, right? What's the one that stands out the most? Probably vehicle, right? So, what kind of a vehicle? For the purposes of this sentence, let's say, at 4 p.m., Jane arrived in a helicopter. very, very different from a car, very, very different from a from a boat, very different from an airplane. So recently, not recently, at 4 p.m., Jane arrived in a helicopter. Okay, but we can get more concrete than that, right? We can get more specific. So at 4 p.m., Jane arrived in a military helicopter. Whoa. All right. So at 4 p.m., Jane arrived in a military helicopter. How can we make this even more concrete? At 4 p.m., Jane flew. Jane piloted herself in on a medical helicopter. Okay, so we're getting significantly more concrete. Your job as a speaker is to use the most concrete words you can to help us get a visual in our brain. So we also want to think about using concise language. So if we're writing an essay, it is okay to have a couple ideas in a sentence. We have compound sentences, we have double compound sentences. We can use really complex ideas. But when you're communicating an idea via spoken language, remember that we're communicating a lot of stuff. So we're communicating through our physicality, we're communicating through our body language, and so that's one stream of information. And then so we're also communicating with the sound of our voice, that emphasis and stuff like that. And we're also communicating with the words that we choose. So we've got all these modes of communication coming at our audience member, and all of this serves to create an image, especially if we're using that concrete language and stuff like that. So you want to make sure you're being concise. And being concise means that you are allowing your listener to get one solid picture in their brain before you move on to the next picture. One solid concept before you move on to the next concept. And what this translates into is you use one idea per sentence. One idea per sentence. And we also want to use the fewest words necessary to express an idea. So if I don't need 5 words to say a concept, I don't want to use 5 words to say a concept. So here's a really concrete example. The death penalty cannot deter crime for the reason that murderers do not consider the consequences for their actions. So I can write this in an essay, and that's going to be okay. But what happens? When we get a lot of that verbal clutter, my brain has to work a little bit harder. So the death penalty cannot deter crime for the reason that murderers do not consider the consequences of their actions. Now, as a speaker, this actually gives me more words to trip over too. So there's a speaker reason not to do this. Try replacing for the reason that with something different. What do you think we can replace for the reason that with? I'm going to suggest because. The death penalty cannot deter crime because murderers do not consider the consequences of their actions. All right, so that's much more specific, much more concise, and it's easier to hear and it's easier to digest. So that's concise language. Now, when we're thinking about narrative style, you yourself, as a speaker, you are going to have a personal style. And this comes down to the words that you choose and the way that you use those words. So if you think about beat poets, they have their own style. They don't all sound the same. And these are some of the tools that they use. We have a tool of repetition. So those just so stories, those the classic narrative stories, like how the beaver got its tail, one thing that they use a lot of is repetition. And they use repetition really frequently. Now, there are a couple kinds of repetition that you can use. You can use literal repetition. So you can use this refrain throughout, or you can use immediate repetition of a phrase for emphasis. So a refrain throughout is similar, and the beaver was talking about his tail, and what about my tail? What do you think about my tail? What do you think about my tail? And you'll see that the beaver repeated that exact question a couple of times, and that's repetition. That's kind of a refrain. An immediate repetition is a little bit different. Immediate repetition is when you repeat a phrase for emphasis. Did you hear me? You repeat the phrase for emphasis. You repeat it. It comes down to style, right? Those two different uses of repetition are exact repetitions, but they give a completely different flavor to the way the words sound. You can be strategic with this as a speaker. You can also think about using thematic repetition, and thematic repetition is essential, especially when you're thinking about a thesis. So your thesis statement is your theme for your speech. Every time you change main points, you want to remind me what the theme is. It's kind of like when you come to the refrain of a song. So within your transition between main point 1 to main point 2, think about that as being verse A and verse B. So between verse A and verse B, we've got to have a refrain, right? And so remind me why you're talking. Why are we gathered here today? We're here to talk about the words that you can choose to develop your style. And one of the things that you can use to develop your personal verbal style is thematic repetition. We're rephrasing the main theme and we restate it. We say it in a different way, but we make sure that the essence is repeated. All right. So now that we've got repetition happening, you want to make sure you are choosing words that will give us an image. And this is very similar to using concrete language. Vivid language and concrete language work together. So at 4 p.m., Jane flew up in a military helicopter. Okay, so that's very concrete. So what would make it vivid? We would want it to appeal to the five senses. So at 4 p.m., Jane bumped the helicopter on the cold, hard ground. Okay, so that's different, right? So it bumped. So what are our five senses? What have we got again? We've got touch, taste, sound, sight. Touch, taste, sound, hearing, sight, and smell. Okay, you could smell the gasoline in the air. You could feel the cold wind Jane can feel the cold wind biting against her face. Okay, so all of this use of vivid language, it allows your audience to go there with you, to create a picture in their brain, and it makes it very vivid. It helps us create the image so that we can experience it with you and all of the emotions that go with that. We experience emotions physically, so if you can give me the physical sensations, those will lead to feelings within your audience, emotions that will help them connect to you as the storyteller. And that's really cool. Now, the last tool that will make up your narrative style is figurative language. And figurative language, it's metaphors and it's similes. Does anybody remember what metaphors and similes are? So metaphors and similes is when you compare two things that are not alike and tell me that they are alike. So simile, that uses like or as. So her face was like the moon. Okay, it was like the moon. That's a simile. Her face was the moon on the window. That's going to be a metaphor, right? Her face was to the window as the moon was on the lake. Okay, so that's going to be a simile. So we've got different ways to create images. You'll see that all of this narrative style is about creating vivid imagery in your audience's brain. So when we are speaking, our goal is to get our message across as quickly as possible. And if we speak in abstraction, it's hard to understand how things play out in real life. But especially if we are persuading people to do something, or we're teaching them how to do something, or if we want them to understand us, the best way to help people understand us is by relating it to the physical world, by relating it to real life, and by creating an image. And as a speaker, you will develop your personal style by use of these tactics. Now, what I want you to do when we are done here is I want you to watch this video. It's by Mark Bezos. and he's an excellent storyteller. In this video by Mark Bezos, In this video by Mark Bezos, what I want you to do is apply the words that we have just spoken about, and I want you to tell me how he uses these words. I want you to tell me how they add to his message. And I want you to tell me how you would like to mimic this in your own speaking style. All right, let me know what you think. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.